Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I want to go ahead and get into some announcements first and then the Lord's table. If you want to skip over this portion and go right to the lesson, you can do so. There's a timestamp down below. So to begin, let's get going. We are going to be worshiping upstairs beginning this week. So if you happen to come to worship service, there'll be plenty of people around to instruct you, but you won't find us down in the lower hall anymore. We'll be up here in the auditorium where we normally worship. And I'll just remind you that you want to look for a pew that has some green tape across the back. So if you're sitting in front of some green tape, you're sitting in a place that we've measured out and is socially distanced from everyone else. So that's what we're looking for along those lines. We'll have to remember again that when we exit and enter, we have to be careful about that. So entry, you come in and sit in the furthest empty seat to the front. So you want to come right to the front, sit in the empty seat and let people fill in behind you. And on the way out, we'll exit as if it was like a wedding or a funeral, where we start at the back and let everyone go out and work our way up that way, so we're not passing one another on the way out. Thanks for all your help with that, and I know people have been very careful and very diligent about following the protocols, and again, I'll thank you and encourage you to keep doing so. Next thing to touch on is the trustees have developed some numbers. The primary one that matters is if we are going above 5 cases a day in Grey Bruce, we will not have services at that point. Now that's a pretty high number. We have never hit that during the whole time we've been dealing with the virus. However, I just wanted to point out that if there's really a pronounced spike in our area, even if it's not 5 cases every single day, we definitely may take a look and reassess. So I just want to let people be aware of that and sort of what to be watching out for in terms of our own local numbers. That's the primary concern. We are also watching the province-wide numbers, and just, again, be aware that if there's a really bad spike and if things are going downhill fast, we may look at not having services. You know, the fact is, the way that we're conducting our worship is very careful, very safe. Everyone's wearing masks, everything's being sanitized. So it's a pretty safe environment that we're working hard to create. And for that reason, we're not too worried about the conditions in the bigger province, but a little bit more so about what's going on closest to home. The other thing that I want to point out is our midweek Bible study. We did meet here at the building in the afternoon. We had some problems. You know, we're all wearing masks, and so we had some problem hearing one another. We're going to move our midweek services upstairs as well, mostly because we're hoping the sound is a little better and because we have the option to use the audiovisual equipment up here that can, sort of help everyone stay on the same page together. So that's the plan moving forward, is to be upstairs and try to take some steps to accommodate so that we can have a little more meaningful dialogue with one another. Okay. By the way, that doesn't mean we'll be taking masks off. We're still going to be following all the protocols and social distancing and everything else. So just be aware of that. Finally, let's now take a moment and transition into our Lord's Table discussion. If you're watching this at home and you need to get prepared for that, go ahead, stop the video and start it up, as we'll be getting into that discussion in a moment here. I want to remind you of a passage that I think many of us are familiar with. It's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and Paul phrases things a little bit differently here and says something important that is worth paying sort of some special attention to, if you will. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul begins to address some concerns in Corinth regarding the Lord's table, and some of it is very, very familiar to us, right? Paul says he received from the Lord that which he delivered, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." Now, Paul seems to be adding this, at least the translators of the English Standard Version believe that he does as the quotation ends. He says, "As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." And often people have asked me, what does that mean, to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes? And it's not terribly difficult. It's very similar, in fact, to what we often do with the death of anyone who's important and significant. Maybe you think of Arlington Cemetery, or maybe you think of the poem of In Flanders Fields, where we're honoring and memorializing the deaths of those who fought for something meaningful and whose sacrifice had a big impact on all of the rest of us. Well, in partaking of this memorial, we're honoring and recognizing Christ's death and its significance for each of us. And we're offering a statement about the significance and the importance of that death. And we're doing so on an ongoing basis, so that from now until the end of this world, it will never be forgotten. It will never be neglected. It will always be honored and thought of. And we as his people will always live our lives in the light of his sacrifice and in recognition of it, so that our lives become a reflection of his sacrifice and his love and his grace. That's what we are saying when we say that we're proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. I hope that's helpful to you, and I will allow you now to stop the video and carry on with your at-home observance of the emblems. If you're watching this, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to reflect honestly as you kind of think through this sort of challenge, if you will. Right? I want to ask, do you think of yourself as a reasonable person? Do you imagine that the things that you do, the things that you believe, the things that you say make sense and are thoughtful and reasonable? If you answered yes, then you're a lot like me. All right? And probably a lot like most people. We all like to think that we're pretty reasonable, we're pretty careful. The things that we do, the decisions that we make are backed up with some kind of common sense, some kind of thought process. But sadly, the reality is we're not. And we don't. Okay? We always make all kinds of crazy choices. And it's very seldom that human beings, either as a whole or as individuals, do the most reasonable and the most logical thing. There are all kinds of things that if you watch someone, and even if you look back on your own life, you'll go, what was I even thinking? Right? I want to offer you just a quick list of examples to demonstrate the point that I'm trying to make here. Look, we regularly get in fights and are even hurtful to the people that we love the most, our family and our friends. We trust people who don't have our best interest in mind, who will hurt us in the end. We procrastinate, right? You've got something important to do. It needs to be done. Does it make any sense at all to say to yourself, well, I'll do it tomorrow or maybe next week? That doesn't make sense. And yet we all do it, and we do it regularly. How about money? We spend money we don't have, right? I need this. I want this. And yeah, can I really afford it? Well, no. But guess what? I'm going to buy it anyway. And I'm just going to hope that, next week the kids don't need shoes, or the water bill, the water tank doesn't break, or something catastrophic doesn't happen, right? So we spend money we shouldn't spend. And then we don't spend money that we should spend. How many times have you looked back and said, oh, why didn't I buy that when I had the chance? Why didn't I invest in this quality item that I needed? And now here I am stuck trying to make do without it. I'm sure anyone who's a bit of a backyard mechanic has thought, why did I buy the cheap wrenches? Right? I should have bit the bullet and got the good ones. All right? We believe lies. We doubt the truth. We miss opportunities over and over again in all of our lives. We are forever doing stuff that makes no sense at all. In fact, often it's so foolish, the things that we do, that we don't want to admit it. We're embarrassed of how dumb we can sometimes be. I know I am, and I know many of you talk to me, tell stories about stuff where you're like, what was I even thinking? Right? And this is part of being human. Right? The list could go on and on. And, We could all share stories, and if you feel like putting one down in the comments, go ahead, that we can all have a good laugh or a good example out of. But let me tell you that despite all the dumb stuff that we do, there is something far dumber, right? There is something that is so irresponsible and so outrageous that no one should ever fall into this trap, but we will and we do. The worst mistake we can possibly make. One that we can't recover from. And by the way, I think we ought to acknowledge how good God is here and how fortunate we are to live in this world, considering how many of the dumb things we somehow get away with. All right, I'm still standing here, even though I've done things that could really have, made a mess of everything, and yet we're okay. And most of the time we will be okay. But there is something so bad, so dumb, that it will completely ruin your life. It will ruin not just your life and my life. It'll ruin society. It'll ruin the impact we have on our children. It'll ruin our eternal future. If we mess up the single most obvious and important thing, we are totally without hope in this world. And what I'm talking about is where we put God in our lives and how we recognize him. So I want to look with you, and I challenge you, get your Bible, open it up. You're watching a video, so you can pause it, you can run and get your Bible. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 24. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 24. Actually, I guess I'm going to read through to verse 25. So, beginning here in verse 18, we read from Paul, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because, again, listen to this, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." In these verses, Paul warns us of the worst, the dumbest, the most foolish, unreasonable, nonsensical thing that we could possibly do, and that would be to fail to recognize who God is and what he has done. Nothing in this world is more obvious or more important than that, and nothing will do more damage to your life or your society than that. And we are living in a society that perfectly fits this description, that does not recognize or honor God and does not want to. And we'll make some points along those lines in this lesson, but I also want you to read these verses very closely examining yourself. Because as Christians, we can sometimes do things that amount to not recognizing the place of God. And when we do those things, despite the fact that we may be giving him lip service, we're just as foolish as those who discount him altogether. And so let's look at some of the things that Paul says here that really sort of describe how we've missed the boat. And it's sort of a cascade that he sets up. The first thing that he says is that what can be known about God is obvious to them, for he's shown it to them. His invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. And what he's saying here is we are without excuse. Point number one, we are without excuse when we don't recognize God. And listen, I want to kind of help you to think this through. Have you as a parent ever scolded a child for doing something that you didn't specifically tell them not to do? And everyone out there's going, yeah, of course I have. Because some things are so blatantly obvious, right, that you shouldn't need to be told, okay, not to, I don't know, take the eggs out of the fridge and throw them around the house. I didn't think I needed to say it, right? So of course, we've scolded our kids for doing something, even though we didn't specifically tell them. We go, you should, what do we say? You should know better. Right? And not only is this something that we do as parents, right? This is something that we do as a society. Our laws recognize the fact that there can be things that are so obvious that even though you may claim to not realize it was wrong, you can't legitimately back up that claim. Right? Maybe you're engaging in a behavior that is so obviously dangerous that you're putting other people's lives at risk to such a high degree that you should have known not to do it because it's too dangerous. Or perhaps there's evidence that you knew about that showed wrongdoing, and the evidence was so blatant and so obvious that you should have acted, and you may be in trouble. You may be guilty for not doing something about something that was so obviously going on. Right? So we have this concept as part of our laws where you can get in trouble for not knowing better. And certainly in the world, the people who are there looking at this creation and are unable, really unwilling to recognize that there is a God who created us, they're without excuse because they should have known better. Now, before we get into that too much, let me point out that Christians may be guilty of this. I can tell you many times people have asked me questions, come into my office and say, what does the Bible teach about this? Or what's the right thing to do here? And oftentimes when I get a question like that, I respond by saying, well, what do you think it means? What have you read in the Bible? And as they begin to tell me, right, they quickly realize, and I realize kind of what I confirm, I guess, what I suspected, that they know what's right already. Right? They knew what the Bible said. Okay? And perhaps they were just looking for justification for not obeying. Right? Hopefully that's not the case. But absolutely we do that. Right? There are times when we clearly know our behavior is wrong, our thinking is wrong, and we try to justify it anyway, even though we should know better. And so, well, yes, we can and should point at those of the world for not doing that, okay, for not knowing better. We should remember that there's always, what they say, when you point a finger, there are some fingers pointing back at you. And what God is telling us here is that you should be able to look at creation and perceive that this did not all just happen from nothing. Right? And I know that some non-believers may watch this and go, man, you're a jerk. You're telling us we're such idiots that we can't see something blatantly obvious. And yeah, I am. Okay, I'm not saying it quite so meanly as that, but I would suggest that there are such obvious indications in creation that that it's a creation, okay, that you have to work to miss them. And there are a number of factors that go into that, and I'm not diminishing that for a second. But let me just make two very, very simple points. The first one is the fact that we're here at all, okay, demands that there has got to be, the fact that anything is here at all, in fact, demands that there has got to be an eternal, powerful, intelligent being to start the whole thing off. Right? Something does not ever come from nothing. It just doesn't. And so when you ask me to believe that it can and that it does, that order comes from disorder and something comes from nothing, I go, yeah, no, that's dumb. Right? I'm not going to believe that because it's ridiculous. And you shouldn't either. Right? So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, even if there was just a rock floating in space, that would be enough to prove that there has to be something going on who created it, because something never comes from nothing. That can't happen. But there's much, much more than just a rock floating in space. Creation is intricate and detailed and thoughtful and beautiful. There are things all around us that demand not just blind chance, but demand a thoughtful, careful, well-executed plan. Right. Now, this could be a whole nother lesson. I'm not going to get into it, but let me just make one point. Okay, because the main pushback for this is, well, there must be purely natural processes, laws of creation. I mean, laws of the universe that explain all of the intricacies that exist, and there are. Okay, but there's a significant difference between laws and a plan. All right, so you can write a computer program. Right? Write a bunch of rules that tell a computer what to do, and that can result in some pretty interesting things. But it can't write a book. All right? So a snowflake is very beautiful and it's complex and it's interesting, but you can look at a snowflake and you can go, I see how these crystalline structures formed. Yes, it's complex. Yes, it's beautiful. Yes, it's interesting, but it's easily explained by nature. When you look at a painting, and I don't mean modern or abstract art, I mean an actual painting by a talented artist who can accurately and beautifully depict reality, okay, you can appreciate the beauty and the complexity of that. But what you can't do is say, I'm sure this painting derived from purely natural causes. You can't. It's ludicrous. You just look at it and go, wow, a talented artist obviously planned and designed this image. And I might add that it's actually pretty easy for humans to recognize that. Right? We can look for the signs in the environment and go, yeah, a person did this. I go on hikes pretty frequently and take the dog and get outside. And guess what? When I come across a pile of rocks, I never have once wondered, I wonder if this pile of rocks came because of the river or because someone put it here. You can always blatantly tell the difference. Always. Okay. And so, because of all of that, to not recognize God as creator is foolishness. And Paul can rightly and justly say, anyone who doesn't do that should have known better, and in fact are going to be found guilty at some point. That's point number one. Number two. It's not enough to just recognize that there's something out there. By the way, lots of people do that. Most people do that. And I get lots of people talking to me who are not Christian people. They're purely secular. They have no religious habits or inclinations in their lives. And they'll say, look, I know there's something out there. I know that all of this did not come from rocks and dirt. All right, I know there's an intelligence. I know there's a power. I know there's a plan behind all of this. It's obvious. Okay. But they don't honor him or give thanks. By the way, Paul specifically says that, right? Even though they knew there was a God, they didn't honor him. They didn't give thanks to him. Right? In other words, they didn't give him the place that he deserves. They didn't give him the credit that he deserves. I want to remind you of a movie that I think probably most people watching have seen. Do you remember in Home Alone where Kevin McAllister, the young Macaulay Culkin playing Kevin McAllister, walks into the motel and he gets a room? Right? At that point, we're all thinking to ourselves, there's no way, right? This is not happening, because we understand that the wrong person is being credited for this, right? A child cannot plan this out to that degree. They can't do it. Right? We're smart enough to look around and say, yeah, this isn't right. We can assess the situation and kind of figure that out. And we ought to be able to look at creation, and the indication is that, yeah, we can do that. We can look at creation and go, this did not happen by chance. There was a plan. Someone built this. Right? But then in our minds we go, well, I wonder what I should do about that. And we go, probably nothing. Right? I'm sure whoever built this doesn't care. Right? I'm sure whoever built this has no plan, has no intentions for me or my life, doesn't know best for me. Again, I think the artwork is such a great analogy here, because creation really is, in some ways, an act of art, of artistry. Imagine you go into the art gallery and you're walking through, and some pictures are pretty good and you're kind of enjoying it, but then you come across this one picture that is just amazing. And it's so beautiful, and just look at it, I cannot, the talent involved here, the beauty involved here. And then your friend who's standing beside you goes, wait, what are you doing? You go, oh, I'm just going to take this Crayola marker and make some changes to this picture. What? Yeah. Look, I'm sure the creator of this doesn't really care what I do with it. I'm just going to, I think that this little river here could have a rock right in the middle. I'm just going to draw it in with my Sharpie. Right? And everyone's listening to this going, right, this is wildly inappropriate. No one would ever do that. No one would ever draw that conclusion. And yet we look at this world in its beauty, in its splendor, in its perfection. And we say, I'm sure whoever did all this is not something I should pay attention to. I'm sure my Creator doesn't care about me or my life. I'm just going to go along and do my own thing. It's inconceivable. And what's more is, it's not a concept that is foreign to us, right? We know enough to honor certain people. We know enough to recognize when something good has been done and give credit where credit is due, whether it be, a great businessman or an inventor or a doctor who discovers, some cure. We know how to honor and credit those people. But we don't know enough to recognize the being who created the entire universe. And look, I know for those of you who are listening to this, most of you are people of faith, and you're going, yeah, what's wrong with those people? But we have to be very careful about that. Because as with our previous point, while we can and should identify this as a problem for those who don't honor God at all, it's just as much of a problem for Christians who only give him lip service. but don't give God the place of honor he deserves in their lives and in their churches. And so, first, we have no excuse for not knowing and understanding that there's a God. Secondly, we have no excuse, and even less of an excuse, for not recognizing and honoring God as the creator of this world and responding to that as we should. But then we take this one step further. All right? We've chosen not to honor God, not to acknowledge God, but now we're going to worship and serve the creature rather than the creator. One of mankind's universal problems is idolatry. Right? And there's a good reason for that. And the reason is we're hardwired to worship. Right? We can't help ourselves. And so we're going to worship something. There's no choice in that part of it. Right? It might be our money, it might be pleasure and hedonism, it might be the environment. There's a lot of that these days. Often, in our time, we place celebrities and athletes in the place of honor and recognition. Right? If you look back to the various deities of the past, when you read the descriptions of them, they're people. Right? Whether you think of the Roman and Greek pantheon or whether you think of various gods of different cultures, they're just describing idealized versions of themselves. Right? And if you read the stories of those gods, they do and have all the same problems that and do the wrong things that people do. And all of it amounts to worship of self. It's just an effort for me to do what I want to do, for me to be in charge of my own life and justify that by pointing to a God who is higher than me, but who's really just like me and just affirms all of my choices. Right? That's about the extent of that discussion. And honestly, even when it comes to the environment or your money, it's really just a matter of worshiping resources, putting resources in the highest place. And think, well, I need this stuff, so it's got to be the most important. There's this great description of the thought process involved here, found in Jeremiah. Okay, listen to Jeremiah as he describes this scenario. He says, a tree is cut from the forest, and it's worked by an axe and by the hands of a craftsman. They decorate it with silver and gold, and they fasten it with a hammer and nails so that it can't fall. Their idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field. They can't speak, they have to be carried, they can't walk. And the humor is so obvious here. You know, it's like Jeremiah is asking the people, right? Did you forget how this all happened? You went out in the forest and cut down a tree. You made it into something, and now you're worshiping it? How is it worthy of worship? You're clearly the one in charge. Right? In fact, so much so are you the one in charge that you nail this thing to the ground so it stays right where you want it to be. And so idolatry, so much of it is really just worshiping me. Right? All the way back from the Garden of Eden, when Satan tempted Eve with the knowledge of good and evil, with being like God that continues to be our problem. And so Paul says here in Romans, you worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator. This is the definition of foolishness. And anyone with any sense can recognize that. The reason we don't is because we don't want to. We want to be in charge of our own lives. We want to justify our own rebellion. And so we do it by finding something we can put in the place of God that doesn't question us, doesn't challenge us, doesn't call us to do better and be better. And so our religious efforts end up just about us wanting to justify our bad behavior. Again, as Christians, we have to remember that when we are pointing at the world, when we're talking about them worshiping the wrong thing and worshiping themselves and putting themselves in the place of God, again, we have to remember the old thing about the fingers. Because there are churches who talk a lot about Jesus, who sing songs about him, but who don't honor him with their lives. They're not interested in change. They're not interested in obedience. In fact, if you bring up the term obedience, you're going to get yourself scolded as a legalist and who knows what else. Right? They're not interested in a relationship with God. They're interested in self-affirmation. Right? Their worship services are completely dictated by what makes them happy and what satisfies them, and don't give a thought to what satisfies the Creator that they claim to be worshiping. Instead, we need to be reminded that we worship the Creator, that we're here to honor God. That what matters about our worship is that it glorifies Him. What matters about our whole lives, in fact, is that they glorify Him. And when they don't, not only are we not putting God in the right place, but we also rob ourselves of all of the benefits that a relationship with God could have. Right? It's no wonder then we go home feeling empty and feeling like church does nothing for us and like our religion does nothing for us. It's because it's not real. It's because it's not religion anyway. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. It's just you going through some exercises to make yourself feel good. And so, as Christians, we have to make sure that, yes, again, while we can point to the world and say it's wrong to worship yourself, we have to make sure that we're not guilty of the very same thing and just calling it, putting a Christian label on it. And so look, we do many dumb, silly things. We do these things despite warnings, despite our own good sense, despite the fact that we know better. And each of us are going to do more of them. All right? That's why we need God. That's why He sent His Son to redeem us from sin. Some things, though, are so devastatingly and obviously bad that they should never be done by anyone. And this is what Paul is describing in these verses, Romans 1:18 through 25. And so I want to close by reading them one more time. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they're without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. And their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen.